I'm getting that point in life. I'm getting like my Uncle Vern. I like to tell stories. Our speaker tonight's Michael Hardy, and I think it was about 5 years ago, and we were planning our Lee Jackson dinner at this very hotel, and I asked our camp members if they had any ideas for speakers. Well, one person said, "Have you thought of Michael Hardy?" And I said, "Well, I know who you're talking about, but I hadn't really thought about it. We thought to throw this out." So everybody's on Facebook, right? So I go home and send him a Facebook message. Well, 2 or 3 weeks went by and I never heard back from him. And I did the Over Mountain Victory Trail March for 7 years. That's from Abington, Virginia to Kings Mountain. And we were about 12 days into the march, and we were at Spruce Pine, North Carolina, and we went to Western Sizzler. Now, when you've been out in the woods for 12, 14 days, the Western Sizzling is kind of like heaven, you know. Bacon looks like it's stacked this high, and the shrimp looks like they're stacked that high. I mean, it was just something. So I'm going to the buffet, and here comes this guy in a white hat, and I thought, Michael Hardy. That's the same picture that's on his Facebook page, same white hat. So I ran back there to tell Ronnie Lale, who's our camp adjutant, that I had just seen Michael Hardy. And I have this real bad habit of saying, "Look there, that guy looks like so-and-so." He said, "You probably just saw somebody look like him." And I said, "No, it's really him." "I think you just saw somebody look like him." I said, "Ronnie, it's Michael Hardy." So we go back into the room, and sure enough, his SCV camp was having a meeting, and it was Michael Hardy. So that's how I met Michael Hardy. And I think a couple of years ago, he was speaking at the Vance homestead outside Asheville, and I told Caroline, I said, "Let's go see Michael Hardy." So we get over there, and this gentleman from New York, if I recall, was like this, telling Michael why we lost the war. And so we go tour the house, and we come back, and that guy's still right here, and I just kind of patted Michael on the shoulder and came on home, so I didn't get to talk to him that day. But I think we're really honored to have Michael with us. He's a member of the John B. Palmer Camp 1946 in North Carolina. He served in a variety of posts from adjutant to camp commander to brigade commander. He's currently serving as the North Carolina Division historian. He's a graduate of the University of Alabama and has just released his 20th book. He's written hundreds of magazines and newspaper articles, and in 2010 was voted North Carolina's Historian of the Year. He lives in North Carolina with his wife Elizabeth and a son and daughter, and they were featured last February on the cover of Citizen's Companion. I don't know who you need to pull that one off. But it's a great pleasure to present to you Michael Hardy, tonight's speaker.
After talking to that Yankee at the Vance birthplace, I know why we lost the war. He talked us to death. Because after a while, I was ready to surrender. I just got tired of listening to him over and over and over again. It's great to be here this evening to talk a little history. If you know me or follow me on Facebook, that's what I do. I travel around and I talk to people and I talk history all the time. Absolutely love it. We're going to look this evening for just a few short minutes about the different places that served as a Confederate capital during the war. What makes a place a Confederate capital? Montgomery, Alabama is an obvious choice. The delegates met there on February 4th of 1861. In Montgomery, Hal Cobb was the president of the convention. They get together and have a meeting and decide that they're not just going to talk about something, they're going to do something about a problem that they see. They are going to found a new government. On February 8th, the Provisional Confederate Constitution was adopted, and on February 9th, Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens were elected president and vice president of the Confederate States. Jefferson Davis wasn't even in town. He wasn't even in the state of Alabama. After he had resigned from the United States Senate, he went back home to Mississippi, and was in his rose garden when word arrived that he'd been elected the provisional president. On February 18th, he was elected the first or the only provisional president of the Confederate States. Other things happened in Montgomery as well. May 4th, the granddaughter of former United States President John Taylor ran the first Confederate flag up above the Alabama State House. It was the first time that that had been done. On March 11th of 1861, the permanent Confederate Constitution was adopted. On April 6th, Davis and his cabinet started planning their response to the refusal of the Federal soldiers to evacuate Fort Sumter, and that fort fell about a week later. There were a lot of places in the spring of 1861 that wanted to be that Confederate capital. In March of that year, the Alabama General Assembly proposed giving the Confederacy a 10-mile square piece of property near Montgomery to build that capital on. One newspaper editor decided that that place should be called the District of Davis and be an independent district. He also believed that it would take 6 years to construct the necessary buildings for the complex. Huntsville was deemed a formidable rival to Montgomery locations, as were Tuscaloosa, Selma, Shelby Springs, and Spring Hill. Tuscaloosa went as far as to send a delegate to Montgomery, to the Confederate government, wanting to give them the buildings that had served as the Confederate capital when the capital was located in Tuscaloosa. Atlanta was advanced more than once, as were Nashville, Tennessee, and Memphis, Pendleton, South Carolina, as well as Alexandria, Virginia, situated just across the Potomac from Washington City. And so folks might say, oh my gosh, they're so close together, how would they ever think about doing that? That's what they wanted. They wanted one capital to be on one side and the other capital to be on the other side of the Potomac River, the Confederate capital. On April 27th, the Virginia Secession Convention sent Davis a copy of a resolution proctoring or wanting to give Richmond, making that invitation to give Richmond to be the permanent seat of the Confederate government. Well, as everything that we do in the South, the Confederate representatives in Montgomery got together and they debated about it. They passed a resolution, the first resolution, on May 10th, saying that the Confederate Congress would go into recess and they would reconvene a few weeks later in Richmond. And that went before Jefferson Davis, and he vetoed it. Why? Because only the Confederate Congress was authorized to move. Davis believed that the government needed to stay together, that the executive branch needed to be in Richmond as well. So the Confederate congressmen got back together and debated once again, and they passed another law that moved the entire facility to Richmond. They adjourned on May 23rd. Jefferson Davis signed it. They adjourned on May 23rd to reconvene in Richmond, Virginia on July 20th. They also approved $40,000 to cover the cost of the move. With that, the Confederacy left Montgomery. Confederate government left Montgomery. Notable buildings in Montgomery used by the Confederate government included the Alabama State Capitol on Goat Hill. I've read why it was called Goat Hill, but that was the name that they chose. Does Tennessee have a, where does the Tennessee Capitol sit in Nashville? Does the piece of property have a name? Because in North Carolina, the Capitol is on Union Square. I'm taking a poll here. I mean, how many odd place names can we have? The Alabama State Capitol on Goat Hill was used by the Confederate government. The Montgomery Insurance Agency became the government building. The Nobles and Brothers building was used. Alexander Stephens stayed at Mrs. Elizabeth Cleveland's boarding house. And to be honest, much of the hard work of establishing the Confederate government took place at that boarding house. Stephens was the person who drafted the rules that governed the convention. Stephens was the person who led or chaired the committee that drafted the Confederate Constitution. That took place at that boarding house as well. The Exchange Hotel in Richmond was the scene of many important backroom debates and discussions, including those that concerned who would actually become the president and the vice president of the Confederate States of America. Everyone recognizes Richmond as the Confederate capital. On May 29th, Davis and a few of the other elected representatives reached Richmond. He was met by thousands of well-wishers and a 15-gun salute, one cannon for each of the southern states. The carriage that bore Davis to Spotswood Hotel he only took about 4 blocks, but he had those thousands of people. Some people consider Spotswood Hotel to be the cradle of the Confederacy. But in all honesty, much of the hard work had already taken place in Montgomery itself. The Confederate government quickly engulfed the city of Richmond. The United States Custom House became the primary government office, with Davis taking the judge's chambers as his own office and using the courtroom as his cabinet room. And if you follow my blog online, I wrote the other day a blog post about the pictures I wish I had. There's a description of that cabinet room, of the table in there, and the large maps that covered one of the walls showing the border states and all of the property of the Confederacy, or the property that composed the Confederate States of America. I wish I had that picture of what that room really looked like. But alas, as far as I know, no one ever took it. Another building, the Mechanics Institute, became known as the Treasury Building. It also housed the War Department and the Judicial Departments. The YMCA building in Richmond housed the Patent Office. Numerous brick tobacco warehouses would, in time, be leased by the Confederate government to be hospitals or for Yankee prisoners of war. Other hospitals like Chimborazo and Winder, the Confederacy's largest, were built from scratch. Members of the Confederate Congress occupied the Virginia State House when it was in session. On a rainy February day in 1862, Jefferson Davis was inaugurated the first and only permanent president of the Confederate States of America. For the next 3 years, Davis led the Confederate government. Major campaigns like the Maryland Campaign, the Gettysburg Campaign, and the attempts to save Vicksburg were planned or at least authorized there in Richmond. Major industrial products like cannons, cartridges, rifles, uniforms, along with the iron plating for ironclads such as the CSS Virginia, were produced in Richmond. Davis and the other Confederate leaders had to deal with issues at home as well, including rising food prices, devalued currency, fallout from the Conscription Act and the Tax in Kind Act, overcrowding, and on a couple of occasions, civil unrest. Refugees, government employees, wounded and sick soldiers and their families quickly pushed the population of Richmond from around 40,000 people to over 100,000. Maybe 120,000. We're not sure. There were times in which the war itself was on the very doorstep of the Confederate capital. Yankees in 1862 reported being close enough to see the church spires of Richmond. And in 1864, Federal cavalry attempted to assassinate Jefferson Davis and to burn the Confederate capital. The dream of an independent Southern Confederacy came to a crashing close on the morning of April 2nd, 1865. Federal forces broke through the Confederate lines below Petersburg, forcing the Confederate government to evacuate Richmond. The train bearing Davis and the Confederate cabinet pulled out of the station that night. Richmond was soon ablaze. All the naval vessels were destroyed. Cotton, tobacco, and other supplies that could not be transported out were set on fire. These fires, along with others set by looters, spread across the city, leaving rampant destruction. In the end, an estimated 900 businesses and homes were destroyed. These included 2 hotels, all of the banks, 3 of the newspapers, numerous mills, drugstores, grocers, salons, shops, and warehouses, along with the local county courthouse and most of the government buildings. Danville is also widely recognized as a Confederate capital, and many see it as the last. The Confederate government's trip from Richmond to Danville took 16 grueling hours, reaching Danville between 4 and 5 the next day. Davis and his government pulled into the depot, and townspeople quickly took them into their homes. Everyone began work the following day of establishing Danville as the Confederate capital. They wanted to see, the politicians, our leaders, wanted the Southern people to see that they were working. The Benedict House, which had served as a girls' school prior to the war, quickly became the principal office for many branches of the government. While waiting word from the Army of Northern Virginia, Davis drafted a proclamation to the Southern people seeking to inspire hope. Just how widely spread his proclamation was is unknown. I have only found it in the Danville paper and the Greensboro, North Carolina paper. It would be his last official proclamation. Word from Lee's army about the surrender arrived late in the day on April 10th. With no principal army left in Virginia and with the Federal Army just a couple of counties away, Davis chose to change bases. He and all but one member of the cabinet loaded onto a train that very evening and set out into the darkness toward Greensboro. That train reached the station in Greensboro around 8 a.m. on April 11th. Federal cavalry under the command of Major General George Stoneman came within minutes of capturing Davis and the rest of the Confederate government. They had cut the rail line just 5 minutes after his train had passed. Stephen Mallory recalled that Davis, learning this news, stated that, quote, "A miss is as good as a mile." On arriving at the station, Davis delivered a short speech to a group of well-wishers gathered at the depot. Greensboro was packed with refugees. The wounded and the sick, plus 20,000 soldiers were camped nearby, remnants of the Army of Tennessee. Davis and all of his cabinet, save John C. Breckinridge, who had not been seen since the evacuation of Richmond, made one important decision in Greensboro. They agreed to allow Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston to open communication with his federal counterpart. Davis and the Confederate government lingered in Greensboro for a couple of days longer. They agreed upon a line of retreat, and Davis set about making sure there were depots to supply the Confederate soldiers as they moved across central North Carolina. But Davis believed that an attempt to negotiate with the Federals was futile, and desiring to reconnect with his family, chose to move further south to Charlotte. From Richmond to Danville and from Danville to Greensboro, the Confederate government had traveled by railroad. But the Federal cavalry had destroyed that line below the town of Greensboro, and Davis and the others had to mount horses or be loaded into wagons and ambulances. At times, some of these ambulances had to travel through fields, and at other times, the men had to use fence rails to lift the axles of the ambulances out of the mud. At Salisbury, North Carolina, the group split. Davis and the mounted portion continued on toward Concord and eventually into Charlotte, while the portion of the group that were being pulled in the ambulances and the wagons took longer to arrive in the Queen City. Greensboro and Charlotte are not often viewed as capitals of the Confederacy. In Greensboro, the government stay was short, with no effort to open an office. In Charlotte, however, the government moved into a bank building, and unlike Danville or Greensboro, the entire Confederate cabinet was present. The various branches and their accompanying staff set up offices in the Bank of Mecklenburg building. Decades later, it was recalled that both night and day sessions of the Confederate cabinet were held in this building, particularly in the office of the bank president. Davis met with several of his generals, including Wade Hampton and Joseph Wheeler, who were attempting to organize cavalry to continue the fight. He also received news of the fall of Mobile and Columbus. One citizen recalled that Davis even entertained a party of ladies coming to pay their respects to the Confederate president. Weighing heavily upon the minds of Davis and his cabinet as they met in that bank building on Trade Street were the ongoing negotiations between Johnston and Sherman. Johnston wrote Sherman on April 14th asking for a temporary suspension of hostilities so that the civil authorities could enter into the needful arrangements to terminate the existing war. Sherman wrote back as soon as he received Johnston's note. He agreed to a ceasefire, and he agreed to give terms to Joseph E. Johnston that Grant had given to Robert E. Lee. But he could not allow or could not facilitate the meeting of the civil authorities. Sherman did add this, quote, that I desire to save the people of North Carolina the damage that they would sustain by the march of this army through the central or western parts of the state. Johnston and Sherman met on April 17th at a Durham area farmhouse owned by the Bennett family. Sherman offered Johnston the same terms that Grant had given Lee a few days earlier. Johnston demurred, wanting instead, quote, an armistice as would give opportunity for negotiations between the civil authorities of the two countries. Sherman stated that this was not possible as the United States failed to recognize the Southern Confederacy or its civil leaders. After 2 hours, the meeting broke up and they agreed to meet the next day. At his headquarters, Johnston sent a note to Davis asking for the return of Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge, who was traveling with Davis. Davis returned, and he and Johnston hammered out the terms of the surrender. These terms were presented to Sherman on April 18th at the Bennett Place. The Confederate terms were so quickly rejected by Sherman, and he claimed that they were, quote, so general and verbose that they were inadmissible. Sherman then drafted his own terms, calling for the Confederate armies to be disbanded. Now, I'll be honest with you right here. I don't like Sherman. Anybody here like Sherman? I do not like Sherman. And as a book that I was working on about a regiment in the Army of Tennessee, I kind of co-read a biography in Sherman's memoirs at the same time as I was working on this Confederate regimental. I don't understand how Sherman got his job, because in his memoirs he was constantly saying, oh, I'm here at Resaca, and I didn't believe the Confederates would be here. I'm here at Cobb's Farm or Kennesaw Mountain. I didn't think they would be here. I don't understand how, he's obviously got somebody smarter than him pulling the strings, but anyway, I don't like Sherman. But the terms that he wanted to give our Southern fighting ancestors were not that bad. Sherman then drafted his own terms calling for the Confederate armies to be disbanded. Weapons were to be deposited at the armories at state capitals. State political leaders had to take, quote, the oaths prescribed by the Constitution of the United States. Federal courts were to be reestablished, and a general amnesty was granted to men who would resume peaceful pursuits. The United States government would not, quote, disturb any of the people by the reason of the late war, so long as they lived in peace and quiet, abstained from acts of armed hostility, and obeyed the laws in existence at the place of their residence. Sherman sent a copy of this document to President Andrew Johnston in Washington. General Joseph E. Johnston likewise sent a copy to Davis, who was then in Charlotte. Davis convened his cabinet and asked for their view in writing on both the military situation and the terms worked out between Johnston and Sherman. The cabinet agreed that resources for continuing the war were available, but believed that the Southern citizens, after 4 years of bloodshed and destruction, had lost the will to fight. We might disagree with that, but we were not there. Everyone was in agreement that Davis should accept those terms. The Confederate cabinet, formed just 4 years earlier in Montgomery, had rendered its final guidance. Davis continued to wait until April 24th. You know, all those people who say that the war ended on April 9th when Robert E. Lee surrendered, it goes on and on through the month of April and into May, and the surrender of E. Kirby Smith and the capture or the surrender of the CSS Shenandoah. Davis continued to wait until April 24th when he finally agreed to the terms. Yet on that same day, Johnston received word from Sherman that the federal government had rejected those terms. Ulysses S. Grant was sent to Raleigh, North Carolina to take over negotiations from Sherman. Grant kind of gave Sherman some counsel and sent him back to meet with Joseph E. Johnston. The ceasefire that accompanied the Johnston-Sherman negotiations lasted 48 hours. For 2 more days, Charlotte served as the Confederate capital. Davis advised Johnston to take his cavalry, mount what infantry horses could be obtained, and prepare to move to the southwest, eventually on into South Carolina and Georgia. Joseph E. Johnston disagreed. He met with Sherman again at the Bennett Place, and new terms were worked out, and Johnston surrendered. On April 25th of 1865, the Confederate government began falling apart. Those are hard words to say. Attorney General George Davis resigned, effective April 26th. Jefferson Davis left that position open while turning the government archives that had been taken to Charlotte for safekeeping over to Adjutant General Samuel Cooper. That morning, Davis, morning of April 26th, with the heads of his state, all of his cabinet members, met at the Pfeiffer home. Secretary of Treasury George Trenholm had been ill for days since they had arrived at Danville. A member of the Pfeiffer family recalled the, quote, the flutter of excitement created in the household when word came that there was to be a short meeting of the cabinet in Mr. Trenholm's room. They remembered seeing those distinguished men, bowed in sorrow, come in a body and pass into the sick room to confer together on the last moment of his concern. Trenholm soon followed George Davis's lead and resigned. From April 11th to April 26th, North Carolina served as the capital of the Confederacy. For those 15 days, the Old North states stood guard over the end of their dream, as the Confederacy's dying hopes were kept alive by the faith that Jefferson Davis had in the Southern people. Jefferson Davis never lost that dream. The other cabinet members went against him, his generals went against him, but he kept that dream alive that there would one day be a Southern Confederacy. In the end, at least for his war-torn people, Davis finally had to admit to defeat. Davis agreed on April 24th to those terms that could have led to his honorable surrender. Remember what I said just a few minutes ago on Sherman's terms, that the United States government would not disturb any of the people by the reason of the late war. Of course, as we know, to accept those terms that Sherman laid out, the federal government would have to recognize our Southern Confederacy, which they never did. There was even a suggestion passed around that Davis be allowed to escape. Sherman claimed this in his memoirs, that two of his general officers proposed to give Jefferson Davis a ship in which he could sail away, saving the federal government the difficulties that would arise should Davis be captured alive. Of course, we know that happened. He was captured alive on May 10, 1865, and incarcerated at Fortress Monroe for 2 years, more than 2 years. Federal government trying to decide how they could try him, which they never could. Montgomery witnessed the glorious birth of our beloved Confederacy. Richmond proudly displayed its banner through its zenith, days of bright hopes and the darkest of hours. Danville, Greensboro, and Charlotte bore witness to its humble demise. Glimpses of the Confederate capital through historic buildings and wayside markers can be found in each of those places today. But the Confederacy really doesn't live in those places. It lives in our hearts. We, the descendants of those proud men who carried its hopes and ideals for 4 years, 150 years ago. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sure you've wondered what Joey Nolan's doing.